I'm back with more controversial knit and crochet opinions, but this time I actually asked you on my Instagram what your most controversial opinions were, and turns out you guys are super messy and pretty much all of the opinions that were mentioned were contradicted by at least one other person. So this one's going to be a fun one. I will also give my take on some of these. Some of these I actually don't have an opinion on, but some of these I feel very strongly about. Before we get into it though, I just want to give a quick little disclaimer and say that my strongest opinion when it comes to knit and crochet or anything crafty is that there is no right or wrong way to do something. There are multiple ways to achieve the same end result. So I don't want anyone to feel attacked by any of these opinions. If you like doing something a certain way, that's absolutely fine. I think majority of these controversial opinions are just personal opinions, to be honest. And the first thing is relating to yarn. This one I do actually feel very strongly about. I don't think there is a perfect yarn. There isn't. I've been told off online for using wool because it doesn't work for people who have allergies. I've been told off for using alpaca because of animal cruelty. I've been told off for using acrylic because it's plastic. And I've really realised that I cannot please everyone. There will always be someone offended by whatever yarn I'm using. There's a lot of snobby ideology around types of fibres. This creates inaccessibility. And I think that is very true. If everyone is fighting and arguing about the kind of yarn that is the perfect yarn and should be used, then beginners don't even know where to start and what they're allowed to use. Whereas I think just use the yarn that you morally are fine with using, that works with your skin and that you can afford. So we have someone saying that cotton feels like string, and someone saying, I love cotton yarn. I also often see people saying that cotton is really difficult to work with and hard on the hands. I get that as well. Knitting and crocheting already can be quite hard on the hands, so you want to work with something that's easy on the hands. I, at the beginning, struggled using cotton. I think as a beginner it can be a bit difficult. I love using cotton now. I think the best way to work around it is to go with sort of a cotton blend as well. People said that acrylic yarn sucks and should be banned. Other people say that they like acrylic yarn, and I think people always feel very nervous to say that they like acrylic yarn because they know they're going to get absolute shit for it. You can use acrylic yarn, I don't care. It's often the cheapest yarn available. It's not going to cause any allergy flare-ups. Someone also said that cashmere is overrated and doesn't hold up well over time, so even the super expensive yarn that people sort of aspire to work with doesn't work for everyone. So yeah, I stand by the fact that there is no perfect yarn. You can argue with me in the comments what you think the best yarn is. I think that's great for you. If you think that yarn is perfect for you, that's absolutely fine. That doesn't mean you have to force it onto everyone else. Then there seems to be a big divide between English and continental style of knitting. This one really makes me laugh because someone said that people who knit continental tend to have a weird superiority complex online. And this makes me laugh because I knit continentally, and honestly, for the first 3 years of knitting and sharing my knitting online, I never knew that that is the style of knitting that I was doing, and then that is what it was called. I just learned to knit the way that came naturally to me. I actually think it is the other way around. There's this whole misconception that English knitting isn't as fast as continental, and I also don't think that is true. I think people need to get out more and go to knit clubs and see other people knitting in real life. I've met many English style knitters who knit just as fast, if not even faster than me. I'm sure knitting continentally makes you more inclined to knit faster, but I'm also sure that there's people who knit continentally who aren't as fast as me. Like, first of all, there is no competition about who's fastest and who's not. And I actually think the people who've made it a competition are the English style knitters. I am sorry. It screams jealousy, the fact that people keep going on about how continental style knitters keep going on about how fast they are. Look, I'm gonna hold my hands up. I've made some reels about knitting fast, but I'm gonna be completely honest. I'm only doing that because I know it's gonna get me views and people are gonna get aggy about it. I think it's funny. I don't care what kind of knitting style you do. The most important thing is that it is comfortable on your hands, and the least important thing is how quickly you are able to knit. Someone said that knitting is less finicky than knitting in the round, and I actually think I agree with that. I don't think it makes knitting in the round any less enjoyable, but I do think knitting flat is more beginner friendly. I also feel like people sort of naturally assume that knitting in the round means you finish a project quicker. But I think sometimes it can slow you down a bit more if you're working with stripes. You kind of have to create this jogless stripe, or you're knitting sleeves that are quite slim. It can slow the process down, and like knitting it flat and then seaming it at the end really doesn't mean it takes any longer. I think this definitely is a case of personal preference. Anything that is knit in the round, you can knit flat and just make that adjustment. I've definitely done that before when I've made like toddler or baby clothes before. I will just knit it flat and seam it at the end. Then there was a lot of granny square hate, which I do not agree with, and it's also this thing of like you personally not liking an aesthetic doesn't mean that everyone else is in the wrong. Like there's many things that I don't think look nice, but I don't think that's a general technique issue. That's just not for me. And the amount of slander that granny squares get is so unnecessary. It's literally so unnecessary. And I also feel like open your creative horizon a little bit more, and maybe those projects that you've seen you don't like, but that isn't a technique issue. It's just how the squares are applied in a way that you don't like. I think granny squares first and foremost are the most fun thing to crochet. I love doing the different stitch repeats as the granny square gets bigger. I love doing colour work changes and seeing how the colour sort of works up. I love then attaching the granny squares and seeing how all the colours sort of add together. It's so much fun. And saying that granny square projects and granny square gums are ugly is such a bad take. I'm sorry. There is a lot of debate in general on knitting versus crochet, which I find so funny, because why do you all have so much beef against each other? Maybe I'm biased because I do both, but I don't think one is better than the other. I don't think one looks prettier than the other, and claiming that is mad to me. Like, it's such an unnecessary beef. The whole debate on which one is easier, I have always claimed that I think crochet is easier, simply down to the fact that you're holding one hook instead of two needles. But I'm sure for other people that works the opposite way around. I think it's such a personal sort of preference on how you work your hands, I guess. I was earlier kind of shitting on the fact that people claim continental knitters have a superiority complex, which I don't agree with. I do, however, think that knitters in general think they are so much better than crocheters, which is just so incorrect. I don't understand where that complex comes from. Like, why do knitters think they're better than crocheters? I don't really get that. But I also just think it's so wrong, because there are some amazing crochet designers out there. My favorite example for this actually is Katie Jocelyn. I love her designs so much. They are so original, they are so cool, they look so good and so stylish, but she isn't trying to make crochet look like knit. She's working with what crochet can offer her and utilizing it in such a good way. And I think that is what crochet should be. I agree that crochet needs to kind of stop imitating knit. It's never gonna look like knit, and it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to look like knit. Knit doesn't look any better than crochet. Someone also said that knit doesn't always have to be turned into crochet projects, and for crocheters to simply learn to knit. Over time, I've actually come to agree with that. I have, for quite a few of my projects, done the knit version and the crochet version because I come from a knit and crochet background, and because my audience is very much split between knit and crochet, so I do of course try and cater to everyone. However, I have recently decided to not do that anymore, mostly because I've become so much more confident in writing knit patterns, and I think I'm so much better at that than crochet. And then there are crochet designers who are so much better at doing crochet than me, and I don't really feel the need to have to compete with that anymore. The only problem I do have, and I will get back to this point later on, is that I will create a knit pattern or a knit design and I'll get requests for a crochet version, which I will not take anymore, but I do have a fear of other designers then just taking that and turning it into a crochet design, which legally they are completely allowed to do because it's a different craft. And I'm sure we all know of a certain case where this has happened and the original designer has kind of looked very silly claiming the opposite craft's pattern as theirs. It's really difficult because I do agree that those two patterns are completely separate, but I do also understand where the original designer's frustration comes from. I don't want to touch on the whole copyright copying thing too much. I think it's a very nuanced discussion that I personally I'm not looking to get into. But yeah, it's definitely been like a worry on my mind deciding not to do crochet anymore. I will probably still do crochet patterns in the future when it's like a very crochet specific project that I don't see myself doing in knit. One person said the project isn't finished until you've woven in your ends. Fair, I guess. I don't really care. I have some projects that I never weave in the ends until like a little bit later on. I do always weave them in at some point just because I find them annoying, but I don't know if I would claim those projects to not be finished. I don't know. Someone said I want my knit to look store-bought. Fair enough. I mean, you put a lot of effort into it, you're gonna want it to look nice. Equally, I think if it looks store-bought, I might as well buy it in a store. But then if you don't want to support fast fashion, but you still want the look that they create, then why not create it yourself? So I kind of get both sides of the coin here. Sweaters are beginner friendly and better to start with than a scarf. I spoke about this in my beginner's knitting guide. I think anything is beginner friendly if that is what you want to make as a beginner. Don't make things that you are told are easy, even though you don't want to make that or you are not interested in wearing that when it's done, because it's not going to motivate you or encourage you to continue with that craft. So yeah, just start with whatever you're most excited to knit. So if you're most excited to knit a cardigan, find the most basic, easy, beginner-friendly cardigan you can find and go for that. Sleeve island is the most fun, easiest and quickest part of an entire sweater. Again, I can kind of see that. The most difficult thing you might have to do on a sleeve is to increase or decrease for some kind of shaping, but otherwise, yeah, you're just going back and forth in the round, so you can sit back, you can watch the telly. So yeah, definitely one of the easiest things to do. Same for if you're doing like a big piece for a body part. I can also see how that's boring because you don't have any techniques to keep you going. I feel no certain way about sleeves, to be honest. I have seen people talk about how if you don't like making sleeves, then you don't like making jumpers, because sleeves are quite an important part of that. It's also how people say they don't like to purl, but it's literally half of knitting. Unless you're doing like garter stitch, half of knitting is purling. So what are you saying? You don't like purling, then you don't like knitting as a whole craft. And I do actually believe in that. So yeah, I don't know, sleeves are just part of it, and then I don't feel any certain way about doing them. And I had some very funny contradicting thoughts about Italian bind off, people swearing by them and people just hating Italian bind off. And this kind of again goes back to the disclaimer I said at the start, where I said there's multiple ways to achieve the same result. So if you're binding off and you love that finished result of an Italian bind off, fair enough. And if you find them annoying and difficult, then also fair enough. I actually used to love doing them when I learned them. I thought they were so fun to do and I really liked the edge. I've kind of gone off them recently and I just do a standard bind off with a larger needle, and I find it gives it enough stretch but also enough strength, whereas I find the Italian bind off for me tends to kind of stretch out too much and then doesn't bounce back, especially after like a couple washes or a couple wears. So I actually swear by the standard bind off, but to each their own. Honestly, the great thing about techniques like that is that they are there for you to use as and when and if you want to use them, but like no one's holding you to it. No one's forcing you to do an Italian bind off. You can think independently and make your own choices, which is so great about knit and crochet. Gauge swatches. Now this one is interesting because lots of people saying they don't do gauge swatches, and then this take made me laugh, which was that people bragging about not gauge swatching isn't a hot take, and I kind of agree with that. I think, again, if you don't want to make a gauge swatch, that's fine, no one's going to hold you accountable for not doing that. However, if things start to go wrong in your pattern, things don't fit how they should by the end, and you haven't made a gauge swatch, that is down to you. It's no one else's fault. It's no one else's problem. You cannot then go on the internet and start complaining about a pattern not looking the way you want to if you haven't made a gauge swatch. The gauge swatch is there to eliminate as many problems as possible. Things can still go wrong. If you use a very different fibre than recommended in the pattern, a gauge swatch is not going to save you because the finished project is going to drape very differently in a different fibre. So that's another thing to look out for. But at least if you made a gauge swatch, you know that you are following the right size, and sizing ideally shouldn't be a problem. Someone said I only knit 2 rows of a gauge swatch and then multiply it because I'm lazy. I'm sorry, but you might as well not bother. That is not a good representation of your stitch and row measurements. It doesn't work. like that, just don't even bother. Your stitches right at the cast on are going to stretch differently than they are right in the middle of a gate swatch. That's why you want to also measure in the middle of it and not the sort of outer stitches where it starts to warp. You also don't want to measure it too far at the top, because again, your bind off is going to stretch out or hold way too much tension. So unfortunately, that is why people make sort of a square, because it is the most accurate representation of what your stitches measure to be. Someone said, I hate amigurumi. I don't get this. This is very similar to like granny squares. Like, why do people keep going on about hating this thing? And like with amigurumi especially, people are so horrible about it online. Now, I get the whole overconsumption thing. Like, I think people don't like when people make and sell a lot of amigurumi at like markets and they don't get sold and then end up in landfill. I think that's the thought process, and I honestly don't know too much about it. But on like a more personal level, seeing all that hate about amigurumi online, and genuinely people are vicious and horrible and mean and bullies about it. Imagine that's all you want to do. Imagine you like little figurines, little toys, little stuffed toys. You want to make all your favorite Pokemons and you want to go online to find some help or read up on some resources, and all you see is people ripping into you for crocheting this. Like, genuinely just mind your own business. I don't like crocheting amigurumi, but then I also don't spend my time thinking about it, posting about it, or looking into it. Like, I simply don't care, so I don't interact with it. Like, it's literally that simple. Then when it comes to making mistakes, this was quite interesting, and I do also think there is like nuance with it. But some people said that if I notice I don't have enough stitches in a row, I would just do an increase. If I make a mistake, I just keep going, no one will notice. And I also do that. Like, if you're off by one stitch, sometimes I won't even correct it unless it's like a chunky project. Then like one stitch does actually make quite a big difference. But yeah, just add it in somewhere where you won't see it, or decrease. No one is going to see it. And most importantly, if you know you're going to be able to forget about it and it's not going to like annoy you every time you wear it, then just fix that mistake mid-project. Literally no one's going to care. Equally, if you feel like the mistake is too big and you kind of know deep down it's going to annoy you in the long run, frog it back. Frogging really isn't that bad, and I stand by this. I've received a couple messages from friends and also from like strangers DMing me saying like, oh, I've kind of made this mistake, what do you think, will I be okay? And I always say the fact that you message me and ask me whether you'll be okay tells me that you don't think you will be, that you will know deep down whether this is going to bother you in the long run, and most of the time it will. And it is always worth frogging it back, fixing the mistake. And I'm saying that from experience, like it is always worth fixing that mistake. I received one DM about this, and I actually personally wanted to talk about this as well, and it is in regards to pattern tests. Now, this person said that they don't like sort of designers exploiting their followers for free labor, short deadlines, and strict rules when it comes to pattern tests, and I 100% agree with that. My personal take is that people are volunteering for me. They are spending their time, they're spending their money to help me perfect my product that I'm putting out there for monetary profit. They're doing all of that at no personal benefit to themselves, and that is always at the forefront of my mind. Like, these people are doing me a huge favor. Like, I would not be able to put patterns out if people weren't testing them for me, so I'm dependent on their help. I haven't dived too deep into how other designers work, but I have, you know, heard about super strict deadlines, designers making people pay for the pattern when they drop out. I don't even really want to like surround myself with that negativity. I know how I'd want to be treated, and that's how I try and treat my testers. I do understand why people would feel frustrated. I am ghosted from at least one, most of the time 2 or 3 pattern testers for each test. Like, I just never hear from them again. I've had people not communicate, changing their sizes and stuff, where I'm very dependent on people following a certain size because I always try and have all the sizes tested. It is frustrating when people don't communicate them making certain changes that are quite important for you. Like, my main thing is just to always communicate. Tell me if you can't meet the deadline. It's absolutely fine. I won't be annoyed. At least I know. But even if things like that happen, I have to overlook those frustrations. That's a me issue if I'm frustrated by that, because like I said, these people are helping me out. Unless I'm paying you, I have no right to demand anything from you. Yes, I can ask for clear communication and for things to run a certain way, but you not adhering to that, I'm gonna have to just let that go. And I think when designers don't do that, it kind of shows a level of immaturity and lack of empathy, because at the end of the day, it's not that deep. Yes, you've been inconvenienced, but who's making money from this? You are. Your testers aren't. Then the last point is about patterns in general. And in my last video, I spoke about size inclusivity, and most of the comments and discussions in the comments were about that. So that definitely is a very nuanced conversation, and I've had people just share their opinions on it in general. I've also had plus size people personally say that they don't care if patterns are size inclusive. So I kind of don't want to speak for people, if that makes sense. I definitely have my opinions on it, but the biggest sort of theme within that discussion that I quite agree with is that not everyone has to write a pattern if you're designing a project. Now, this is a difficult thing to talk about because I understand why people do write patterns, because it's the simple concept of demand. If you are creating a design and there are loads of people asking you for a pattern for it, that's basically loads of people saying to you, I will give you my money for your product. Now, who wouldn't say yes to that? Obviously, you'd want to put a bit of work into that if you are able to make money from it, especially if you're able to make money from something that is a passion of yours, that is a hobby of yours. If you are designing something and you choose not to write a pattern for it, it is gaining quite a lot of traction online, there's a lot of demand for it, other people are going to notice that. If you don't see that demand, or if you choose not to react to that demand, other people will do it for you, and they are going to write a pattern for your design, and they are going to monetize that, even though it is not their original idea. And I think that is the problem. Like I said, I don't want to get into the whole copywriting thing. I do not know enough about the law behind copyright. I just don't even want to start that whole conversation. But I understand why people write patterns, even if they're written badly or they're not graded, they're not tech edited, whatever, because it gives them some kind of physical evidence, some kind of security that this design is theirs. Whether they're able to claim that or back that up, that's a whole nother discussion. Designing something and writing a pattern for it are two separate skills, two separate things that people get into. And I do think the only way to progress in pattern writing is to do further research into grading, into sizing, like beyond knitting or crocheting itself, just generally fashion-wise, how do things fit certain bodies, and how does the sizing, the stitch amount increase with those certain bodies? If you're not interested in doing that, that means you are not a good pattern writer. And that's not me reading anyone or shaming anyone. It's just the simple fact that pattern writing isn't a creative skill, it's a technical skill, and a technical skill demands technical knowledge. And on the topic of size inclusivity, being size inclusive is not an aesthetic choice. Not being size inclusive is an active exclusion. You are telling people straight up, this is not for you. I didn't make this with you in mind. If you don't like a pattern based on the fact that it is super basic, or you don't like the design or the shape or whatever, but it has a large range of sizes, so you technically could make that, but you choose not to make it based on aesthetic choices, that's a whole different thing. At least you had the option to, and you were able to make that choice. That choice wasn't taken away from you or not even given to you completely. If the size range didn't even include you, you wouldn't have even been given the option to make that choice. I also do completely understand plus people saying that they don't care for all patterns to be size inclusive, especially if the designer isn't plus size, because what would they know about things fitting a certain way? So they prefer to follow patterns from other plus size people, and I 100% understand that. I don't think it's an excuse for non-plus size people to not cater and understand how to cater for plus size people, but I do understand why plus size people would just stick with plus size designers, 100%. I also prefer to look for projects that are worn by people who have a similar body to me. Like if it's modeled on someone with slim hips and a small bust, it's gonna make me worried about how that will actually look on my body. I'm not surprised when they don't look how I want them to look, but I do always have that hope within me that the pattern may be thought about things that I need you know? I also think on the other side, making certain adjustments to your project following someone's pattern is absolutely fine and not always the pattern designer's fault. Like if you know you have a longer torso or a larger bust to waist ratio and you generally struggle with clothes already, you probably will know that you need to make certain adjustments somewhere. Or even more general, like I know how I want certain things to fit. Like I might still really like a pattern in a project, but there might be things that I know will look funny on me, so I'm going to make that adjustment. But that's not the pattern designer's fault. Like you can't think about every single person's differences. You know, there will always be needs for certain adjustments, but you shouldn't have to adjust like a drop shoulder all of a sudden coming down all the way to your wrist because it was graded badly. Or something that I have really struggled with is patterns increasing in length whilst also increasing in width. Like I can tell something wasn't graded properly because I'll follow my bust measurement, but then all of a sudden, whilst this part is getting wider as I want it to be, this part is also getting longer. And I think just because my bust is wider doesn't mean my torso is longer. So things like that, you shouldn't really have to adjust. And that is why I think every single pattern should have a schematic measurement chart. Every single tech editor actually that I've worked with has always checked me on that and made sure that I have a schematic measurement. At the start, I never really understood why, I didn't really care for it, but I just always included it because, like I said, the tech editors told me to. And I'm so glad they held me to it, because I get so frustrated now when I follow a pattern and they don't have it. Because basically if you have a schematic in front of you and you know what the finished garment is going to measure for your size, you can measure that on, I don't know, your body or other garments that you like wearing, and you can figure out, oh, actually the armhole and that is way too deep, so maybe I will start joining further on, or that length is looking quite long for the top of my torso, I know I want it shorter. I can then make that adjustment. So it just gives each person the ability to make something fit their body. And I really think that is the beauty of knitting and crocheting, is that you are able to make something fit your body. And that's also limited by a lot of patterns because you are following the pattern down to a T, but it might not always be perfect for your body even though you love the design. So maybe for beginners this isn't super relevant because you won't really know where to make those adjustments until you've made a few projects and realized sort of a common issue you're having with your garments. But once you get past that point and you've made that realization, you've got that experience, you will be able to identify those needs for adjustments in the schematic if it's available, and your project will turn out perfectly. But yeah, a lot of patterns don't include it, and I find it frustrating because oftentimes I have to make the garment to then figure out where to change it and then start again, which is, yeah, it just wastes a lot of time, really. That is everything that I have to say. Do let me know if you disagreed or agreed with any of this. I learned so much nuance on a lot of things that I mentioned in my last video, so definitely share it with me. Just obviously let's all be kind and nice. I'm sure we all will be, but yeah, let's just all remember most of this is personal opinion and preference. Thank you so much as always for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and hopefully I'll see you next time. Goodbye.